And the recording is just so that everyone who registered will get a link to the session afterwards. And that will be the only use of it. I'm not going to distribute it more broadly than that. So welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. For me, I've just come back to work, so it's just a lovely way to start the new year, being in conversation with folks about crossing the divide. So let me share my screen. All right. So welcome. I'm glad you're here. I want to acknowledge territory. So I'm located on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin people in a place that settlers also know as Ottawa. So that's where I am today. I'm not always here, but that's where I am right now. So our topic is crossing the divide. And I'm going to pull a few stories and experiences out of my recently published book, Leading Together. But I want you to know that we're going to do another webinar on this exact same topic in April, and I'm going to talk about different ways to cross the divide there. So if you want more after this one, sign up for that one too, and we'll talk about other and different things. So as we settle in, I want you to ask yourself, why this webinar? What drew you to this conversation? What's happening in your community, in your work, in your life, in your world that had you say, oh, crossing the divide is the topic for me this early in the new year? Just maybe take some deep breaths and kind of settle in and think about your motivation. You know, I think our intentions matter so much when we gather together, and just being clear on what's your reasons for participating. And so, of course, today is kind of a vague and you know, there's no sort of malicious intentions, but if we're really clear on what we're thinking when we're engaging with people, particularly folks who maybe think totally differently than us, then that helps us be aware of our own reactions as well. If you've worked with me before, you've heard me say this. This is a quote I came across a few years ago, and it always makes me pause and reflect every time I go to design or lead a conversation. That being heard is so close to feeling loved that for the average person, they are almost indistinguishable. You know, I think, what will people experience when we come together in conversation? How will they feel when they leave our discussion? We use the words, you know, so often in this space of conflict or engagement or facilitation that we want people to be heard. But are we creating spaces for them to feel loved or worthy or like they matter? I think that's the distinction that creates the shift when we have conflict or we have a divide. I want to be really honest, because I've worked in this space for a really long time, that I have really struggled with despair and even burnout over the last decade of doing this work. Sometimes I have really wondered if there is a way forward, or we're just going to be stuck and the divide is just permanent, and that's how it goes as we move forward. I actually wrote my book as a call to community, like wanting to connect with other people who want to be in this space, as a call to action to cross the divide together, because I think we can't leave it to somebody else. I think it's up to us. So here's a quote from my book that kind of sums that up. It's so easy to be against things, and it's so much harder to be for something, to build something up even when it's difficult and uncertain. I want connection, deeper understanding, trust, and strengthened relationships in the organizations I work in the family I'm part of, in the communities I live and work and play in, so that we see, hear, and understand each other. I want to be part of a movement that sparks a desire to see the humanity in each other, so we can each heal our rifts, divides, and fractures, and so we can solve the complex, difficult challenges we face. So I want to invite a space of sharing and gratitude and possibility for the next hour or so that we're together. And I'm so truly grateful that you're here, that you're yearning or hopeful or curious or maybe stuck and looking for some, something that that will help you find a way through. So let me give you just a sense of this session. We're going to spend just a little bit of time on this pivotal moment we find ourselves in, because whatever you're experiencing in your organization or your community or your group, it's actually it's like an echo of what's happening around us. Then I'll give you some tips and tools and ideas about how to cross the divide, and then just an invitation to continue in community, right? That call to action, to being together as we move forward. I want to be really clear about something to set the expectations, though. I want to note that there are no checklists, worksheets, or top 10 lists that you're going to walk away with today. I think sometimes people come with, okay, like, just give me the answer. Like, just tell me how to fix this. And this space of polarization, of the divide, of, deep conflict connected to our identities and our values, there are no quick fixes. There's no easy answers. It takes an awful lot of working with the complexity that created it to be able to dismantle it. It's kind of big, heavy work, I think. It took a long time to be created, and it's going to take a long time to address. And I guess the other thing I want to say is I don't have all the answers. So if you thought I did, you're in the wrong place. In fact, actually, I think as my work goes on, over more than 25 years, I think I have more questions than I have answers. And I think the way I see this work evolves as I go. So I'm going to save time at the end for questions. And if you've got them as we go through, like if I say something or, something comes up or you've got a specific challenge, just pop it into chat. That way we've got a record of it. And I'll save time at the end to answer some of those questions. And if I don't get to all of them, I will answer them, but I'll send them out as some additional answers. But just to be clear, that's maybe just one thing that occurred to me. There's probably lots of other wisdom on this. So I want to start with this moment we find ourselves in. And I'm going to ask you to use annotate. So if you're on the Zoom app, this will work great. And if you're not, no worries at all, you can use chat. If you're on the Zoom app, I want you to find the annotate tool. So it will be, you'll first see it up top where you see you are viewing Steph's screen. And then there'll be a menu that says view options, and you can go down and choose annotate, and it opens up a secondary menu, which is this menu at the bottom. And I want you to choose a stamp. If that's way too complicated and you're eating your lunch and you're just listening gratefully, then don't worry about it. You can use chat, whatever works, but I'm going to pose a couple questions for you, and you can either stamp them on the screen or you could put your answers into chat. All right. So here's the question I want to pose to you. What are you experiencing when it comes to anger, polarization, division, and disconnection? I want you to think about your experience, your organization, your life, your community, and your work. And I want you to either stamp the statement that's most true for you or put the number of the statement into chat. I'll just give you a minute to think that through, to read through those statements. Which is the one that's most true for you? Thank you. A couple on number 3, one on number 2, lots on number 3. Things have improved. That's great. We got a check mark there, and a mix of all the above. That's great. And if you, just a reminder again, if you can't access, annotate, go ahead and put your number into chat. What I want to really affirm is that all of this is true. People are experiencing different things in different places. And in some places where capacity has built, you can feel the shift. You can see the divide narrowing. In places where people are working really hard to cross the divide, to learn how to talk to each other, you can see people coming together. In places where the opposite is happening, where conflict is high or emotions are high, the reactivity and the tension can be higher. And so all those things can be true. And sometimes I think we think about them like they're anecdotal, right? Like, well, this is just my experience, or this is just my session, or this is just this group that reacts that way. But I want to give you a sense of what is really happening in the world because, like I said earlier, right, it's an echo. What is happening around us is happening between us and is also happening inside us. So I'm going to just stop sharing for 1 second. Thank you for all your stamping. And I can just clear the screen. Otherwise, every other screen I go to is going to have all these beautiful stamps all over it. So just let me stop share for 1 sec. There we go. And I'll just keep going. So this is what the research shows, is what is happening around us. So first of all, effective polarization. So you probably understand polarization, right? Like my way or the highway, yes or no. But effective polarization is where I align myself with a group of folks who think similarly to me. And that creates a sense of connection and belonging, a sense of rightness, even sometimes is part of my identity, who I am to stand on this side. But then I look over at other people who I disagree with or who are not on my side, and I think that I don't just disagree with them, they are wrong. And I extend that to the fact that I think that they are bad people too. They are my enemy. They could cause me harm, and all of my emotions escalate, and then the divide increases. And it might not just be about the issue we disagree on, right? Like, think of all the things in the news: climate change, vaccines, affordable housing, protecting the environment, even things like the Israel Hamas conflict. I extend my feeling that they are wrong to everything about them. So it's not just their stand on this issue, they are just all round bad people. And then therefore everything they think is wrong. When effective polarization is at play, the people don't want to help other people who may be in need or live in the same neighborhood or work with them. This comes from the Edelman Trust Barometer 2022 and 2023. Only 30% of people would help someone who disagreed with their point of view if they were in need. Only 20% would be willing to live in the same neighborhood, and only 20% would be willing to have them as a coworker. This is just if they disagree with them. There is a rise in loneliness and disconnection. The World Health Organization has declared loneliness an epidemic. The pandemic made us further marginalized, isolated, and a rise in mental health challenges. There is distrust in government and media, and even government and media are seen as driving division, heightening distrust, that there's a failure of leadership in government, in the media, and they're contributing to the divide. Democracy is on the decline around the globe. There's a rise in populism and extremism, a rise in autocracy, people who are less free or not free at all compared to 5 or 10 years ago. There is war. There's Ukraine and Russia. There's Israel and Hamas. But there's also Sudan and Somalia and the Democratic Republic of Congo and Nigeria and Ethiopia and Yemen and Myanmar. The world is at war, and we see those images, on our screens, on Instagram, on the news, but we know family, community, colleagues, neighbors who are affected, right? The world is a small place, and that 6 degrees of separation is ever present. And the thing is that we internalize the pain, the psychological and emotional impact, even if we are not directly affected. And we carry it with us into our organizations and into our community discussions. And I'll tell you, over the holidays at my family dinner table discussion of these things, we carry it with us into these things. Threats and intimidations of public officials are on the rise. Now, this data is only from the US. I mean, it's only because I can't find data in other countries, but I'm sure that it's similar in many other places as polarization increases. Now, 87% of local officials, like local government, folks who work directly with the public in the US, have noticed an increase in levels of harassment, threats, and violence. Most of it happens online, like in social media or online, but it's also happening at public meetings and outside of work hours, like when they go to the grocery store. I promise I'm going to stop with the Debbie Downer stuff in just a moment. I'm almost there. In 2023, the World Economic Forum produced a list of risks. They produce it every year, the top 10 risks facing humanity. In 2023, the fourth greatest risk facing humanity for the next decade is the erosion of social cohesion. That's the divide, polarization, disconnection, facing humanity. But they just put out their list for 2024. In 2024, social polarization is the third greatest risk facing humanity for the next 2 years. And misinformation and disinformation is now on the list. It's number one as the greatest risk facing humanity for the next 2 years. We cannot solve the challenging problems we face if we can't talk together. There is a video the World Economic Forum has put out about these top 3 risks, and I'll send it to you in the follow-up. It's short, it's only maybe 3 or 4 minutes long, but I've kind of summarized it here, but if you want to go in more depth about the top 3 risks facing humanity right now, I'll send you the link in the follow-up email. Now, what's happening outside of our organizations is also happening within us and between us. And so that means it's happening in your organization. So McKinsey and Company put out a State of Organizations report in 2023, and it shows a real disconnect between the leadership employees yearn for and the leadership they are experiencing. Only 25% of employees in organizations say their organization leadership is engaged or passionate or inspiring them to be their best. So all of that list of doom and gloom is we've got a problem. We have a big, complex, messy problem facing humanity. And that problem is really grounded in how we work together and how we talk to each other. So now that you're all in despair, there is reason to hope. So, in my experience, 25 years of doing this work, there is division, but there's also a yearning for connection. There is polarization and a yearning for change. I led a session last year with participants on a project I'm working on in California, and we had a participant who said something like, and I'm going to totally paraphrase it here, but something like, I'm really tired of government representatives coming to my community to practice their active listening skills, right? Where they come and they sit and they nod their heads and all they're doing is waiting for their turn to speak. And instead, I want them to come to my community and practice deep listening. And she described it like where they sit and they listen and they understand our lived experiences, our values, our hopes, our challenges, our concerns, until that understanding is in their bones. And when it's in their bones, then they can speak, then we can talk together. And when I heard her say that, it just felt so powerful for me, because you can feel the boundaries there, right? I'm tired of this. It's enough of this way of interacting, of how we talk to each other. And an invitation, a generous invitation to something else. If you can show up this way, I can meet you there and we can have this conversation. And I think all of these things, all these good things, the generosity, the invitation, the yearning, they're present in this time, along with all those other things that I talked about. I really believe it took about a zillion decisions, choices, and actions to get us to this moment in time. And those decisions and actions, they led to systems and structures that protect those decisions. And it's going to take about the same number of decisions and actions to get us out of this place, right? So I think that's why it's about us, each of us stepping up, doing something different, making a contribution, choosing a different way of interacting. So I'm hopeful about change, because I think I know what it can look like when we work together in totally different ways. So I'm going to just pause there. I just want to see if anybody needs to let any tension out based on where we've come to, and then I'll start diving into what can we do then. I'll just pause for a second, see if anyone has anything that they need to say, that they want to offer. You can put it into the chat, you can raise your hand, whatever works for you. I know you're mostly all a group of strangers. I'm sort of your common point, and that's okay. So if you don't want to voice something, that's all right. Oh, Shireen, you just nailed everything that's been going on in the past few months. Thank you very much. Sometimes it just takes somebody to name it, right? You can feel it, you can sense it. You're like, what is going on? Sometimes you feel like you're in the middle of a tornado, and just having someone affirm that, yeah, this is all real. Thank you, Cameron. It feels good to have this articulated. I like the contrast of how those negative statements are actually opportunities in disguise. Yeah, that's right. Well, it's about our mindset too, Geneva, right? How do we see these things? Do we see them as challenges, I think, as burdens, as things that are almost impossible to overcome, or do we see the possibility in them, the opportunity, the passion that could allow us to shift? Particularly when one's job is to help or guide, it can feel as though you're responsible for how badly things feel like they're going. Absolutely, Shireen. It's this, I think I talked at the beginning about, a sense of despair sometimes, or even a sense of burnout. Like these are heavy things to carry. And I think that's why we need more of us, the more of us who can step in and practice this, how we talk together. All right, thank you. Thanks for taking that little pause, for just kind of reflecting where you're at. I'll go back to sharing the slides. Okay. Yeah, go for it. Did someone just raise a hand? No? Okay. All right. So I want to tell you, and you probably know this if you signed up for this webinar, that I have a fundamental belief, and it's the basis of all my work, it's the foundation of my book, but it's actually how I try and live my life. Not always successfully, to be truly honest, but how I try to live my life. I believe that brave, honest conversations are how we solve the problems in our lives, our organizations, and communities. And it's not just that the conversation helps us solve our problems, it's that the conversation is the conduit, right? It is the way through. And in that conversation, we can create deeper understanding, increased connection, stronger trust, better relationships. And I think when those four things are present, we can solve any problem. When they are not present, we can do just about nothing. And so I really believe it's time that individually and also collectively, we make different choices, because when we do, we'll get different results. I like to think that a crisis is a horrible thing to waste. And so if we're in this pivotal moment of time, let's learn from it. Like, let's step into it instead of trying to avoid it. Maybe the conversation will allow us to center each other's humanity in the discussion. And I really think that when we all have a yearning to be seen, to be heard, to be understood, we can be part of the solution. We can create spaces where we take people with us. I wonder if anyone is familiar with the work of Valerie Carr. That name rings a bell. I see a couple of heads shaking no. She wrote a book called See No Stranger, a memoir and manifesto of revolutionary love. I will tell you, her work is so beautiful. It's transformational, and it calls on us, I think, to see the world through a different mindset. Here, I'm going to just pop a link to her work into chat, and I'll put it in the follow-up as well. But this quote of hers, I think, turns the table on how we see these times, right? It's like challenge or opportunity. So maybe these are not really times of death and divide, right? If the darkness is not the darkness of the tomb where we end, but perhaps it could be the darkness of the womb, could be a place of rebirth, of possibility. Like, what if these dark times are leading us to create something, to build something, to grow something? And I think that is absolutely a beautiful sentiment. And if we can hold that mindset, then conflict is a possibility. The divide is a possibility, to see each other better and different and create something new. So how do we cross the divide? Finally, 25 minutes in, I'm going to get there. How do we cross the divide? So I have three ideas I want to share in this one, and then reminder that in the April one, I'll share three other ones, and maybe we'll do another one in November and I'll share three more, or read my book, or take a training with me, any of those things. So I want to talk about building community capacity, increasing complexity, and then stepping into courage. So those three things are what I'm going to cover in this session. So let's start with building community capacity. Capacity for brave, honest conversations, right? To talk to each other in that space of the divide. I think it's important to remember that no one is born knowing how to have these conversations. So I think sometimes we sit them down and we think, well, let's talk about this really hard emotional thing. And then they don't have the skills for it. We end up with tension and reactivity. And then sometimes we're surprised. Well, they're capable, educated, passionate, interesting, committed people and all sorts of things. And yet they can't talk about this thing. Well, that's because people aren't born knowing how to talk about these things, right? We're talking about the how do we have these conversations. So I want to take you to a place called Denman Island. It's the traditional unceded territory of the Pentlatch people. That includes Comox, Siamen, and Qualicum First Nations. And it's in the Gulf Islands between Vancouver and Vancouver Island. A couple years ago, I was invited there by the Denman Island Reconciliation Committee. Now, that's a group of Indigenous and also non-Indigenous community members working together, like on a whole bunch of issues that were really affecting the community, things like climate change adaptation, reconciliation, access to clean drinking water. But they had found over the last couple of years that conflict was escalating among community. Like they'd bring community together to try to solve problems, and emotions would run high, and trust was fraying, and relationships were splintering. And in some cases, people would refuse to come to a conversation if someone else was there, right? Like they just wouldn't engage with someone who they had decided was, wrong. Now, this community is a beautiful place. It's got about 1,000 residents, and they're retirees and artists and environmentalists and farmers and people who commute to the mainland. It's a passionate place, really committed to protecting the environment, but they've had experience before with being faced with really difficult issues like blocking a coal mine or lots of other development applications. And so they have had experience talking about hard things in the past, but somehow that experience wasn't helping them when it came to some of these really, really difficult issues. Now, it's also a very whimsical place. It astonished me that just about every single watch out for deer sign I saw had wings painted on it. And it just kind of speaks to the community spirit. The community hall is just like this beautiful, great room with a bunch of fireplaces, and it's made of local timber. And that's where we decided to hold the conversations. Now, after a lot of discussion with the Reconciliation Committee, oftentimes I get a phone call like, can you come and facilitate a conversation and help people find a way forward? But after a lot of conversation with this group, I said, well, I don't know if that's the answer, because I can come and facilitate a conversation, maybe over many days, that helps you find a way forward. But when I'm done, you'll have found a way forward on that particular issue or at that moment in time. But what happens when the next one comes up? What happens when you have the next emotional, difficult conversation that you need to talk about? So we decided actually we would invite people to be part of something different, to immerse them in a learning experience where they build their capacity to lead themselves out of polarization. And I think the question is, what if we redesign our processes to talk together, to build capacity about how to talk together at the forefront, and then we talk together about the issues. Now, some of you on this call have had direct experience with me in doing that, right? Your organization gets stuck. We work together to build the capacity of individuals in the organization to talk together. We get you to a certain point, and then you keep talking because people have the reminders and the capacity. And I think that in our families and in our communities and our organizations, the more we learn, the better we get at talking together about difficult things. And the more we create different experiences, the more we close the divide between each other. So I want to encourage you to do this in every project where polarization and disconnection learn. Now, I'm only going to play, so I gave you an example of me going to deliver training to a group so they could lead themselves out of polarization. I want to give you another example. I'm not going to play this whole video, I'll just play 1 minute of it. But it's another example, and it'll be familiar to someone on the call, of one group that wanted to build capacity, individually to prepare people before they even get into a conversation. So you can do it lots of different ways, but it's about helping people think about how we talk together, not what we talk about. So I'll just play 1 minute of this video. It's an example of another way to build capacity. Hello, everyone. It's nice to be with you again. This video is really focused on preparing yourself for important conversations, the things you need to think about, the things you need to do, the ways of being you need to consider to actually set yourself up for success in important conversations. I want to start here. Oftentimes we run from one thing to the next thing and then race in to our conversations. It's so important that we just take a couple of minutes to prepare ourselves and to think about how do we want to show up in these discussions, and then therefore what might be the outcome or the impact of the conversations that we have. So if we can take a few minutes to prepare ourselves, we can see where the conversation might take us. Anyways, that just gives you a sense, right? It's a tool that even before we go into the conversation, it says to folks, hey, you're going to be in this conversation. It could be hot, people could get bothered, it could be messy. So here's some things to think about before you go in. Take 20 minutes to prepare yourself, do some reflection, and then we'll have this conversation. It changes everything. Now, oftentimes you have to do it multiple times, again and again, but I want to encourage you to think about every time you're going to have a conversation where there is a polarization, where there is a divide, that we start with how do we want to talk to each other, not what are we going to talk about. And I think that's the lessons in building community capacity, is that before we can talk together about really challenging, polarizing topics, we need to talk about how we talk together. And then when we get alignment on things like respect and listening and kindness and courage and learning, we can tackle tough topics. But we've got to do that first, because then we've already agreed that we want to walk out of this conversation feeling respected. We want to go in prepared. We want to be able to understand where someone else is coming from. If we can agree on those things, then we can talk about the hard thing. So I'm going to go to increasing complexity, but I'm going to stop again and just see if anybody has any questions before I dive into kind of thing number 2 that can help you cross the divide. Let's see if there's any questions that are burning for you about what I've said so far.
No, no questions, Steph. But yeah, just it's interesting you refer back to that video that you prepared for my organization, and we have used it a few times for sure. When we know there's a really crunchy topic on an agenda, we have used the whole video or reminded people about it, or created a little excerpt, like a 10-minute, either before the meeting, or we actually even showed it before a really tough conversation. We showed it right in the meeting, and just kind of watched as people learn from that right in the moment, kind of thing. So
yeah,
that's brought beautiful. You into the meeting without actually bringing it.
That's great, Carolyn. That's why you've got it. No, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that example, because when we're talking about challenging things, right, the emotion goes in waves too. And so sometimes just pausing and creating that reminder that, hold on a second, this is about each of us, right? This is about how we each choose to show up and participate in this moment that's hard. And how do we stay, and what will help us stay? So thank you, Carolyn. And Geneva, I see your question. Do you have suggestions on how to do that in a limited time or with a group you only have together once for a short session? So first, I'm going to give you the answer you don't want to hear, which is you should change your timelines. And I know oftentimes, right, that's leadership in your organization, or that's elected officials, or someone outside of the process or the conflict has set the timelines, and they're unrealistic. So I just want to totally acknowledge that. And I want to say that's a thing that contributes to the divide. When we think we don't have time for that, right? We have to get some progress and some results, and we got to check the box, and we got to talk about this issue. That contributes to the pressure cooker feeling that escalates the conflict. So, okay, so now I'll just say, okay, I get sometimes you just got to deal with what you've been given. And so you have limited time. If you're going to only bring it to a group together once, I would start your conversation with, what do you need to participate at your best? What can you contribute and what do you need from the group? And I would start the conversation there, not some other agenda topic. And I'd give that, enough time till you get people really clear on, what does respect mean for me, right? Someone's going to say, I want to be treated with respect. Okay, well, that's great. But what does that look like? What does that feel like? So can we all get agreement that that's a thing we want to walk out of with? And you can do that in a pretty limited time frame. And the thing is it's a little bit like you go slow so you can go fast. If you do that, then people are ready. They're ready to talk about the issue. So that's an example, recognizing you have lots of constraints. Unless you can go back to leadership and say, maybe we should change our timelines and build this capacity to talk about these issues. Because sometimes if you go too fast, actually things just escalate. And then you'll know you have to push pause, because pushing things through, people need to pull back, especially if they're really hot issues, like if they're connected to identity, deeply connected to values, if you have growing opposition or a sense of that effective polarization, then you might have to push pause. Anyway, I hope that helped a little bit, Geneva. Okay, great.
It does. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so I'll go back to sharing my screen and let's talk about, there we go, increasing complexity. So this is a hard one because I think the more complicated or complex the issue is, we've been trained to kind of break it into chunks, right? To make it simple, to break it down into sound bites or key messages, to make it simple so everyone understands it. However, the thing that's really counterintuitive is that when we simplify things too much, we increase or escalate the conflict. So when you think about effective polarization, or if you just watch the news, I actually was in the car yesterday listening to, what's it called? Ontario Today on CBC. And anyways, it's like a call-in show and the on CBC. And they were asking how Canadians felt about Trump winning Iowa. And and she was looking for sound bites. She was looking for emotional reactions. She was looking for just a quick hit. But what she was looking for was the side. She was seeking the polarization. Who's here? Who loves him? Who thinks it's great for Canada? Who's here? Who thinks it's horrible? Right? She was looking for the divide. When we make things really, really simple, actually we escalate the conflict because it becomes really simple to say I'm for or I'm against, and you're bad, you're wrong because you're not on my side. And I think, and then people cling to that side, right? And it makes really complex problems look like they're simple and easy to solve, but they're not. And what we want to do is actually help people see all the gray, all the nuances in the middle. So here's a really good kind of metaphor for the divide that happens. That game Red Rover. Do you remember that as a child? It's where there was a group of folks on one side of a field and a group of folks on the other side of the field, and everyone held hands really, really tightly, and then they would call someone over. I don't even know why you would say call someone over, as if you were inviting them to join your side, because you weren't. And then they would run across the field as fast as they could, and they'd smash through their arms. Or not smash through the arms. It always resulted in hurt bodies, hurt feelings. It is my least favorite game as a child, least favorite game. But that's one side and another side and a big space in the middle. And I think in conflict and polarization, how we define the sides impacts whether we can close the divide between them. Is one side good and the other side is bad? Is one side right and the other side is wrong? And where does identity and values come into play with the side that we have chosen, right? That makes it so much more complex. I think we have to ask ourselves, what's our intention when we have these sides? Are we calling people to join our side? Are we trying to persuade them and convince them to change sides, right? Like that they're wrong, and let me tell you all the reasons why you're wrong and you should think differently. Or trying to make our side so strong that the other side can only collapse. I think our goal in the space of polarization is to set an intention of letting go of our side, the rightness of our side, and stepping into the field between, which means we got to be okay with the gray area and let go of the certainty that we are right and the other side is wrong. If we can let go of that, we can create deeper understanding. We can understand the other side, and then we can find some place to move forward. It's that there's a Rumi quote that always comes to mind when I think about Red Rover, that out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. And I think that that field is that field in the middle of Red Rover. So I think what we want to do is change the conversation and invite people into the complexity. We want to acknowledge what they know about the side that they're on. And we want to invite them to recognize that there is more than that maybe there are other people who have really valid reasons and values to see that situation in a different way. Now, sometimes we get muddied with people saying, the facts and evidence and data are on their side. And I think that facts and evidence and data, actually, they stand in the middle of the field. They stand alone. But what we do is we take the facts and the evidence and the data and we overlay them with our values and our lived experience and our perspectives, and then we call them our facts, right? And they become our truths. But I can have a truth on an issue that's grounded in my lived experience, and you can have a truth as well. And sometimes our truths are different. So there's my truth and your truth, but what we want to do is create a space for deeper understanding so we could find maybe a shared truth that we could move forward together with, something different that we choose together. So I want to give you an example of that in action. I want to take you to Langley, BC now. So for those of you who are outside the country, it's a suburb of Vancouver. It's approximately 30,000 people, I think, who live there, about that anyways. It's a small city. Until recently, it has been one of the most affordable cities or suburbs of Canada's second most expensive city. But as Vancouver has grown to be more expensive, Langley has experienced an increasing population of folks without homes. So like a lot of communities across Canada, across the US, actually across the world, Langley's got a housing crisis. Now, there have been many proposals for development, but few of them are affordable. And also, like so many communities, there is a lot of opposition to affordable or supportive housing in established neighborhoods. Like, I want everyone to have a home. I just don't want you to build that here. That kind of sentiment, right? Not in my neighborhood, right? Everyone deserves a place, but let's put those people someplace else. That kind of sentiment expressed in the community. Lots of judgment, lots of resistance, lots of stigma. Now, so to be really clear, this is not to make people who hold those views wrong. It's to help us understand that those views exist and how do we work with them, not to convince them of something different, but to understand them. Now, Langley has got a ton of well-organized opposition. I was really surprised when I was brought in to do some work with them. There are petitions and campaigns and protests, lots of community groups talking to each other to learn how to oppose affordable housing in every neighborhood, right? And there's lots of stories being told in the community about other people. Now, last year, I was asked to help the township and the task force. They have a housing and homelessness task force to address the opposition and resistance, but they had a big question, a really big question they wanted to solve. They wanted to answer, how do people change their minds? It's a huge question, especially when you're talking about supportive housing in established neighborhoods. But they also had a goal. Can we get people to change their minds about supportive housing? And so really what they're asking is, how can we get rid of stigma, the stigma that feeds resistance and opposition in ensuring everyone has a home? So they wanted to actually have a conversation about that stigma. And if you want to pick uncomfortable, messy, complex conversations, talking to people about stigma and potentially their own stigma is really, really challenging. And so let's go back to that question. How do people change their minds? And so I just want to see, what idea do you have? How do people change their minds? I'll give you a second. You can unmute yourself or you can pop it in chat. If you were asked that question, what would you say? How do people change their minds? You can think about any issue. My example is supportive housing, but in your experience, Shireen.
In my experience, people change their minds when their hearts are touched.
Oh, beautiful. Absolutely, right? It's not a head thing, it's a heart thing. Absolutely. When it matters to us and we can connect to it deeply. Absolutely. And Cameron, you've put into chat through impactful stories. Yeah. Because stories are how we make meaning, right? And so as humans, that's the thing that connects the emotion and the data together to allow us to make meaning. Lindsay, did you just turn on your camera because you wanted to share?
Yeah, I was thinking I've seen people change their minds when they meet someone and they learn about their experiences and they have a face to put to a different opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. The other is not just some sort of faceless person or group that you can kind of dehumanize, right? It's a real person with real stories and real experience and family and a history, all of those things. Yeah. And Gurtej, that the alternative feels emotionally safe. Yeah, because you can't feel accused of being discriminatory or racist and think you're going to change your mind, right? You have to actually feel like, oh, now I see this. I see that this matters. Yeah, learning about the benefit to themselves and their community, totally, absolutely, Valerie. Yeah, having their fears alleviated. So all those things that are underneath the judgments and the assumptions that we create about people. Will I feel safe? Do I understand this? Okay, so fantastic, great insight. So I'll go to some of the other things that help people change their minds. I will say it's not easy. So that's the first place to start, right? It's complex to support people to see something that they feel very strongly and they're really connected to see it different. But what really helps people change their minds is through a combination of conversation, because that conversation is the conduit to deeper understanding. And it's not conversation alone. They must also have a different experience. So the conversation itself has to feel different. There has to be different people in it. It has to be in a different space. It has to be with different questions that they walk out feeling differently. And that opens them up to new ways of seeing others and the issue. So stigma is uncomfortable and it's complex, but to change people's mind, we used to focus on education, right? We'll just explain to them, we'll educate them. But new research has actually been done on all those campaigns to reduce stigma grounded in education. And it says, actually, that's not really working. It doesn't shift resistance and opposition and the stigma. What does work is dialogue, getting to know the other and tapping into empathy and compassion. And honestly, that's our opportunity, right? To create the space for a conversation that feels different. So if we can't call people out about, say, stigma, we want to call them in instead. We want to hold the tension of a really difficult conversation and make it okay to have their own perspectives and experience and really gently and generously help people have new views and experiences. We can ask totally different questions. So here's a couple questions you could ask. What do you believe about people who already live in this community? What do you believe about people who will live in new homes in this community? What might be some things that could surprise you? What could this mean for us as a community? So we need to slow the conversation down. And that really goes to that question that I think Geneva had about what if we don't have time for this? But if we slow the conversation down, we can break apart assumptions, we can create generosity, we can create a new experience talking about the hard thing. And then once we're done that, we're sort of off to the races, because then people are ready to go, they've got relationship and connection and deeper understanding, and we can solve that challenge. But we got to slow it all down first. So that, because also when we slow it down, we reduce the emotional reaction. It becomes lower the slower that we go. So increasing complexity requires three kinds of complexity. So we need to increase our contradictory complexity. So that's engaging directly with information and people who have different worldviews and perspectives than our own, and actually actively seeking that out, or creating the space so that those different worldviews and perspectives are invited into this conversation, where instead of only talking to folks who think like us, we're talking to folks who totally see the world differently. And that results in a deeper understanding of those views. You know, one of my earliest experiences as a child and a young adult was having conversations with my grandfather, who, and some of you might have heard me tell this story before, who was just a real diehard Republican. So a Texan Republican. And he was a petroleum engineer. He believed, people pull themselves up by their bootstraps. He believed in small government. The list was on of the things that he believed in. And when I was young, he called me the pinko of the family, which was the 1950s term for communist. And but I could talk to him about anything. Like, he was curious about my views. He didn't ever actually agree with me, and I didn't ever actually agree with him. But we could be in a strong relationship, have a deep understanding, right? Sometimes we think our goal, especially in complexity and polarization, is to create agreement. It's not to create agreement. It's to create alignment. Are we more committed to this relationship, to seeing each other, to talking together, than we are to being right? And even if we see the world totally differently. So that's contradictory complexity, but it's also complexity of social identity. So that who we are talking to is not the same old people we're always talking to. And the thing is, when you put contradictory complexity together with complexity of social identity, what you get is cognitive complexity. What we understand is so much more than what we understood before. It's so much deeper and richer and more nuanced. Okay, I'm going to stop there, because then we're going to go into step into courage. And I'll just see if there are any questions or comments or anything anybody needs to say before we step into courage. Yeah, sure. You absolutely see it increasingly in social media. If you don't think like me, I don't want to talk to you. And actually, that's how those algorithms are designed, right? Is to find like-minded folks. And so, absolutely, the social media is amplifies the divide, and is not a place to go to solve these challenges, complex challenges. It makes it worse always. Although it is a great place to go out and find people who think differently than you, and perhaps invite a conversation if you're brave enough. But don't invite the conversation over social media. Just don't do that. Maybe ask them if you could have a conversation to understand them, where they're coming from. Okay, let me go to the last thing, the cross the divide, step it into courage. All right. So I think when we think about a competency for doing this work, I think we easily and first off go to skills, right? What do we know how to do? Then we go to knowledge. What do we understand? But courage is a way of being, and skills, knowledge, and ways of being fall under our definition of competency. And I think we need to put as much emphasis into the being as in the doing in order to cross the divide. So I think that stepping into courage is the ultimate, kind of affirmation that it starts with each of us. We can't wait for someone else or some other leader to cross the divide. And I also want to acknowledge that stepping into courage is so easy to say. and so much harder to do. You know, I often feel like before I lead a challenging conversation, or even honestly, I just spent the weekend with my parents. So a conversation with my father, I sometimes feel, you know, shaky and my heart beating fast and a little bit like I might vomit, right? Before I lead a really hard conversation. And so that, you know, that tells me that it matters. Those feelings tell me that be present. This really, really is important rather than run and hide. But that's because I have the experience that when I feel like that, oh, pay attention, something's happening here, you know. And so I think we have to figure out, where are we calling forth our courage from? And what's the source of your courage for you, right? You have it based on the times that you have been brave, the things that you have learned. And sometimes we think that courage is, you know, running off into battle, but I don't think courage is like that. Courage is, you know, holding the hand of an elderly family member while they die or take their last breath. Courage is saying yes to getting married or to having a child or moving someplace else to take a job, right? Courage is all these acts of our lives. I have a sticky note actually right here above that I keep above my computer. Is written by one of my children, and it echoes something that I used to say to them all the time when they were young. And you probably know this saying. It's from Christopher Robin to Winnie the Pooh, that you are smart, you are strong, you are brave, you can do anything. And I sometimes put this sticky note in my pocket or, you know, right on my screen when I need that kind of courage. Sometimes I say to myself, you can do anything for 30 minutes, right? You can be in this conversation for 30 minutes, right? Set a timer, just stay for 30 minutes. And then maybe sometimes when that 30 minutes is over, I could do it again for another 30 minutes. I think that sometimes it's easier to call forth your courage and begin the conversation than it is to stay. Because, and I think it's interesting because oftentimes we think the hardest part is beginning, right? How do I say to that person I need to talk to them? How do I say I don't agree with this? And could I understand it better? But actually, I think stepping in is action. So beginning is easier. Staying, right, is where your heart beats fast, where you feel sick, where someone says something that pisses you off, is offensive or hateful or hurtful, and then it's even harder, I think, to stay. And so you need to know the source of your courage and how you might apply it. This quote is from my book, and I think it's what I want to share with you about courage and what it requires of you to have these conversations. That I've learned that how you show up and what you stand for matters most in these conversations, not your knowledge, role, or position, not your answers or your technical details. The energy and emotion I bring to this conversation impacts the space. Can you be loving and kind when others are full of rage, anxiety, and rigidity? Can you set boundaries with a generous heart when others are rolling with chaos and fear? Can you invite people to find their feet in discomfort and fear and stay long enough to seek the meaning and the wisdom the experience presents? That's, I think, what these moments require from us. They require something different if we're going to cross the divide. I want to share a really short video. A couple of years ago, I did a series of video interviews with folks I think are doing really astonishing work in this space. And I play this one pretty regularly when I kind of give talks or webinars, because it's just a 1-minute clip that says so many things so beautifully. So this video is a former mayor, she's not the mayor any longer, Lisa Helps from the city of Victoria, and her talking about what is required to cross the divide.
What would be your advice, your best advice, or some of your insights to other people, or in particular other women wanting to take a step forward into the public arena, to hold the space for brave, honest conversations? What would be your advice?
I have two pieces of advice. The first is, people often say to me, oh, you must have a really thick skin to be in this job. And I say that's completely the wrong metaphor.
Yeah.
Because if you have a thick skin, it means that nothing gets in, right? It's a barrier. And so my advice is to keep a relentlessly open heart.
Yeah.
And that way all the shit can wash through and get cleaned out,
Yeah.
and then all the good stuff percolates and stays.
And I just think that's, you know, I've heard it so many times, but every time I hear it, I think, yeah, you're so right. You're so right. And it's an acknowledgement too, right? That these conversations are messy and you might get your buttons pushed and you may be reactive too, and yet still choose that open heart or whatever it is that this moment and this conversation requires from you. I want to share a process that I use to prepare myself. You know, I think preparing ourselves to stand and stay in these conversations is crucially important. I ask myself 3 questions. How do you want to show up, right? In this moment with these people, what are you committed to? And what impact do you want to have? And the answer to these 3 questions forms what I call a stake. And I want you to think I think about like the stakes that I tie tomatoes to, right? A great big wooden stake that goes into the ground. And I imagine that there's a little rope tethered to the very bottom of it. And it can be as long or as short as you need in a given moment, but it is also tethered to your ankle. So a stake grounds you and it pulls you back when the conversation goes sideways, or maybe when your heart is beating fast and you get sweaty because someone has said something that's hard. So when you answer these 3 questions, they really answer like, how will you meet this moment? How will you meet these people? What does this require from you? And so here's a couple of examples of stakes that I have written for real sessions that I have led. And that grounds me. So whatever happens, because nothing ever goes the way you plan, ever goes the way you plan in a challenging conversation, this always pulls me back. When I'm loving, open-hearted, and generous, committed to growth and learning, the conversation expands with possibility, right? And then if I stand in that, you can withstand just about anything. Doesn't matter how hard or passionate the winds blow. When I'm brave and committed to surfacing the real issues, resolution emerges. You know, I wrote one for today's session because I write them for anything I lead, that when I am generous, loving, and relentlessly open-hearted, in the words of Lisa Helps, the space expands with possibility. So that's what I'm standing in this moment. And then that means that, you know, whatever happens, I'm present to whatever the conversation takes. And I think that's the thing to ask ourselves when we're seeking our courage. What will this moment, these people, this situation call for from you? So I'll just leave you with a little summary of some of the things that we've covered. I think a measure of your success is your commitment to trying, not how well you do it. There's no perfection in this space. There's a zillion mistakes you can make. If you can own them, take responsibility for them, repair relationship, take responsibility for your impact. It's about, are we here in this space attempting to cross the divide, attempting to build a relationship and deepen understanding? Are we calling people in to be for something rather than calling them out? Sometimes you have to call them out, but ideally, we're taking people with us. Are you able or willing to embrace discomfort and welcome complexity, to sort of invite it in and to reject the simplicity of the divide? Can you create new experiences and patterns of talking together, showing up with courage and compassion and integrity, just whatever it is that the moment calls for from you? Can you center humanity, recognizing that people are not just the one thing they said or that one position that they took? They are that and so much more, right? We are all these things and so much more. And I guess I would also say that this is a life's work. I think there is so much to constantly learn, like to harvest the learnings from every conversation, from every challenge, from every moment that you succeeded or that you didn't. My biggest learnings always come from the moments that I didn't. And if you want to dig in and learn more, sign up for those April webinars. Join me for training in 2024. I'm going to put the links into chat. Read my book, I'd love that. Or I do custom training, right? About really what your issues are, like that video I showed that Carolyn talked to, right? How do we bravely lead challenging conversations together? And then you can find my book on Amazon, or you can order it through an independent bookstore. And that's it. So let's just pause. Questions, comments, stories, sharing. We'll take 10 minutes and see what we can get to. And if there's any questions I can't get to, I'll send them in the follow-up. What have you got? What's running through your mind? Shireen.
So having some experiences in the last few months of highly polarized conflict in my workplace, that's largely being driven by trauma and fear. Like for us, it was the Israel-Hamas conflict, just kind of triggered kind of this catastrophic cascading set of events, where we had, people were reacting and they were fearful and they wanted leadership to take a side, support me. Like that was how they wanted to be heard. Like when people jump to the only way I can feel heard and safe is if you do what I tell you.
Yeah.
And if you don't do what I tell you, you're betraying me. I'm unsafe with you.
Yeah.
How do we navigate trying to create that field in a moment like that? I'm sorry, that's probably an unanswerable question, but that was the thing that brought me here today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a huge, huge question. I think, okay, so it goes to everything we've talked about today. Actually, I think you step back from answering that question, take a side, right? You step back to, wait a minute, how can we talk about this together so that everyone, I have a deep dislike for creating safe spaces. I think that's wrong because there will always be situations where people don't feel safe. I think instead, how do we create brave spaces where people are willing to say what they need to say and to be heard as well? So that's the question, right? How do we create a brave space where we can talk about this together in ways that deepens our understanding, that preserves relationships? And that's where you start. How do we talk about this conversation? Because that will start to surface some of the fears, right? I feel attacked. My identity is attached to this. I feel betrayed when you don't take a side and stand with me. And so, but that also speaks to, right? So I need to be able to say what's most important to me, and I need people to listen. And right. And then, so you start there, I think. But I think people also need to understand too, that how their own reactivity contributes to the divide. So just to be able to step back and talk about another issue and map it out and see, okay, well, look, when we take this stand, how are we contributing towards transformation or resolution or peacefulness, and how are we not? So that's, and honestly, we could talk for hours. I know we're going to talk tomorrow about this, but we could talk for hours about it. You have to begin with capacity. If you go straight to the issue, it only splinters, I think. Yeah, such a good question, and such a loaded issue because it goes right to the heart of identity, of how people see themselves. Somebody else got a burning, big, messy question, Carolyn?
I guess I'm curious, what do you do with the occasional person who just doesn't kind of come around, like you're throwing every good strategy at them and they're just not, and most people are coming around, they're starting to see better ways of engaging. Like someone's stake might be, you walk them through how to do that really well, and their stake is when I am confrontational and I hold my ground, I get my way, you know what I mean? Like they just don't play ball.
Yeah.
Can you give some strategies for how you handle that kind of a person?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I would start with a one-on-one conversation, a conversation about impact, not about intention. And so, and not in a blaming or a shaming way, but in a welcoming and inclusive way. I want to have a conversation with you about how your participation is impacting others, our issues, our progress, or the space of our conversation. And let me tell you what I've observed. But before you even share what you've observed, start with what are they experiencing? Maybe they are feeling cornered and attacked. Maybe they are feeling fearful of what matters most to them. And so how can they get their needs met in the conversation? Maybe they have no other way of engaging, and that way of engaging has always worked for them in the past, right? And so I'd start there. I'd start in building understanding and relationship, but also a recognition that these conversations they contain reciprocal responsibility, right? They are responsible for the good that they create, the progress that they make, and for the harm that they contribute as well, right? We're each responsible for what happens in our conversations. And I start there. And then I would have a new conversation with the whole group. Once you've kind of surfaced some of that, I have a new conversation with the whole group about how do we want to call each other in when we participate in ways that are challenging to the group. But you got to watch for that. You can ask that question, get some answers, but what you don't want is people taking that as a license to, when we don't agree, I'm going to call you on it, right? Because you're not trying to create an incubator for sameness and harmony. You want that diversity of opinion. You want that dissonance because it creates innovation. So you just got to watch, and maybe you have to make that distinction when you're asking that question, right? How do we call each other in when we're creating challenges in our process?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Gurtej, I see your question in chat. Any insights on how to care for yourself during challenging times with the project? The words that come to mind are compassion, fatigue, and indifference. Wow. So that's a question I have spent decades working on, and I'm not sure I have the answer for you, right? This is a constant relearning for me. My experience is not so much the compassion fatigue, right? That's one way that a lack of resilience goes, right? The kind of numbing. My experience is the other way. It's like I hold the weight of every painful thing anyone ever said, and then I end up in a pit of despair myself. But both of those things, I think, are symptoms of, or maybe signals of impending burnout, right? So I think my best suggestions are that you have a conversation with your team, to know when can you tap out. So when is it that you are finding yourself numb to the things that people are saying? When do you need to step back? And can the team itself support each other on that, right? Who needs a break from this conversation? Who needs to step away from it? Who needs to not attend a community engagement session? But you have to do all the things too that I think build your joy. And maybe joy is a weird word to use in this process of conflict, but actually joy is the antidote to despair. And so what are the things that build that joy in your life? Because that builds your resilience. And do you have enough of them? And can you even institute them in some of your engagement processes, right? Conflict doesn't have to be all like doom and gloom. Can you create games and playful questions and lightheartedness and humor into the space of conflict? Because what we're looking for is things that shift the space. And shifting the space, of course, comes from deeper understanding and connection, but it also comes from the space suddenly feeling different. So if you can institute playfulness, it is, and you cannot be, for example, curious and judgmental at the same time. And so if you can institute something that feels dramatically different, then actually that might help your own lightheartedness as well. I'm sorry, I don't have a simple answer to that. As I said, I have spent decades relearning that. So yeah, it's a work in progress over here. Anybody else? All right, my friends. So I'm going to send this video out with a couple of links to some resources, whatever it was I said along the way over the last hour. I'm so grateful for you being here. So grateful for you being here. It's like that call to community, that call to action. It's nice to know there's other people with big burning questions about how do we cross the divide and bring people together. I'm really grateful to know you're out there doing this work, thinking about these things. Reach out at any time, and I'll send you a link to the recording as well. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.